The New Testament often speaks of us being dead to sin, but what exactly does that mean? Today on Dining Room Devos, we look at how Christ's death sets us free. We're going to finish out 1 Peter 2, looking at verses 24 and 25. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. We've talked in our last couple of videos about how Peter tells us to respond when we're being mistreated. But really the whole section we've been looking at the last few weeks is how we are aliens and strangers here. We don't live the way we used to. We used to live in sin, and our actions reflected the sinful nature that controlled us. We live differently than we used to because we are new people. In fact, Peter tells us that we are chosen people. So where before we met Jesus, we would respond to abuse with vengeance and slander and pride, we don't do that now because we are dead to the values of this world. But there's another aspect to being dead to sin that I don't want us to miss. I love classic cartoons, and I love the old Droopy cartoons from the 1940s and 1950s, and maybe you've seen it. There's this old Droopy cartoon where this wolf escapes from prison, and Droopy's a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who's sent to go find the wolf, and everywhere the wolf goes, he always finds Droopy somehow already there waiting for him. And what makes the cartoon so hilarious is the wolf's facial expressions and reactions to him not being able to escape Droopy. You know, sometimes we just can't seem to shake our sin and temptation, can we? Sometimes we're kind of like that wolf that finds Droopy everywhere he goes. Only there's really nothing funny about it. But Paul addresses this in Romans 7, verses 21 through 23. He says, "So I find this law at work. When I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within my members." Paul is kind of saying, I can't quite seem to shake these sinful habits as much as I want to. Can you identify with that? But the good news is that there's hope, and Peter addresses that in his letter. He says of Jesus in verse 24 that he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. Now, Peter calling the cross a tree is a reference to the law of Moses. There's this verse in the law of Moses that says that anyone who's executed by being hung on a tree is under God's curse. See, Jesus didn't just pay the price of our sin like someone might pay your parking ticket. He was declared guilty of our crimes, and he came under God's curse until his death. Jesus has taken all of our sin, past, present, and future. But the problem is that we sometimes still carry it around with us, the guilt and the shame for our sin. I mean, we may know that God has forgiven us, but let's be honest, sometimes we just can't seem to forgive ourselves. Jesus said that if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Are you carrying around the guilt of sins that have already been forgiven? Turn that over to Jesus. You don't have to carry it any longer. Jesus has taken the curse. He has been cursed for you. He's taken the curse, all of it. There's none left for you. By his wounds, by Christ's wounds, you have been healed. Your relationship with God has been restored, and you are completely and forever forgiven. In verse 25, Peter says, "For you were like sheep going astray." He does something interesting here. He quotes Isaiah 53:6, and we talked briefly about Isaiah 53 last time. But Isaiah 53:6 says, we all like sheep have gone astray. It says we have gone astray. Now those words imply a kind of finality, like we have gone astray and it's too late for us. And so the context means that Jesus had to die for us because we were just too far gone. We could not be restored to God if Jesus didn't die for us. But when Peter quotes that verse here, he changes the verb tense a little bit. He doesn't say we have gone astray. He says you were like sheep going astray. Do you hear the difference? It's subtle, but it's there. Peter doesn't say who we are. He says who we were. We were like sheep going astray, but we aren't now. We have returned to our shepherd, Jesus, who came looking for us, who died for us and redeemed us, and who has brought us back to himself. Jesus said, no one can take us from his hands. We are safe and free to live differently, free to live for Jesus Christ. General Jonathan Wainwright was the man in charge of U.S. forces in the Philippines during the first part of World War II. And as the war went on, General Wainwright and his men were outnumbered and they lacked supplies, and he ended up having to surrender the Philippines to the Japanese in 1942. And he felt like he had failed his country. He and his men were sent to a prisoner of war camp in Mongolia for the last 3 years of the war. After the Japanese surrendered in 1945, news didn't reach Mongolia for some time. General Wainwright didn't know that he was free. He continued to behave like a prisoner of war, and he continued to take orders from the Japanese commander of the camp. But eventually, a U.S. plane did land. General Wainwright was informed that the Japanese had surrendered, and then things changed. He walked into the Japanese commander's office and said, "My commander-in-chief has defeated your commander-in-chief. I am in charge now. You must surrender." We no longer have to behave like a prisoner to sin because we have been set free. We are dead to sin and we have victory through Jesus Christ. May you walk in that victory this week. We'll see you next time on Dining Room Devos. God bless.